Hello, Rachel.
Hey John, how are you?
Wonderful.
Good.
Next time you speak to me, it will be up in country like you live in.
Oh, are you coming to visit Paul?
No, not at this time, probably later in the summer. But what I'll be doing is going up to Oklahoma with, we have that place on the river, and it's very similar to where you live.
Nice. Oh,
Yeah.
that's great. Yeah.
Weather's almost as nice as what you have every day.
Nice. Oh, that's great.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I've talked to Paul about when we come back this summer, I want to make sure and figure out a way we can kind of get together and see you face to face.
Oh yeah, that would be fun.
Yeah, and is Chris going to be winding up his activities soon, or is he?
I don't know. They did a 3-month extension, so that's through August.
Yeah.
And then he doesn't know what's happening after that. So there's lots of rumors. Some people are saying, oh, it'll end in August, and then other people are saying, oh no, we're gonna keep it going for another. Some people think up to 2 years,
My
so
guess that
no one
part of the
knows.
infrastructure takes a long, long time to reconstruct.
Yeah, that's the problem. It
Yeah,
takes so long to build it.
yeah. And all that stuff has long lead times. And
Yeah.
it doesn't happen quickly, even though we
No.
would like to see it happen quickly.
Yeah. And I think like they have to build it while they're still using it. You can't just shut off the
Yes,
water. So
that's
that
right.
makes it so much more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the way things go. It just you got to fix it while you're riding it.
Right.
Just the lead time alone on big motors and pumps and all of that stuff is just
Yeah.
unbelievable.
Yeah.
So you'll be maintaining the homestead
I'm
for
trying.
a
Yeah.
while longer.
Yeah.
Y'all have chickens?
Yeah, we have chickens.
Oh, that's great. So you have
Yep.
fresh eggs every morning and
Yep. 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 We have fresh eggs.
yeah.
Yeah. We
And
have ducks. We get
you
we
have
get duck
ducks?
eggs every once in a while.
Oh, really?
They're not as good a layers as the chickens, but we get a few a
Uh,
week.
Tell me, how do duck eggs compare to chicken eggs?
I think they're pretty similar. It's like having two yolks in one. They're a little bit bigger and it's mostly yolk.
Oh,
So,
really?
yeah.
Okay. But the flavor's the same when
I
you,
think so. It's not that different. Yeah. And
huh?
I bake with them and you can't tell the difference when I bake with
Yeah.
it.
Do you know what mud hens are?
I don't think I do.
Coots.
Like guinea
No,
or
they're not a duck, but they hang around with ducks on lakes and ponds.
Oh, yeah, sure, sure. Yeah, yeah.
They eat a lot of different kinds of things. I'm not sure what they are, but they're quasi migratory, but they tend
Okay.
to stay in one place, I think.
Yeah.
Uh, when I was a little kid, I raised chickens,
Oh, yeah.
and I had more money than I ever had in my life selling eggs.
I bet. Yeah. Well, especially right now.
Oh yeah, well, it was kind of like now, except that the eggs were selling for $2 or $3 a dozen, and of course back then everything was about a tenth of what it is today. Anyway,
Yeah.
I thought I could get coot eggs and get the chickens to hatch them. They hatched the coot eggs, but then they killed the baby coots.
Oh,
Yeah.
well,
So anyway, it didn't work. And I
didn't work
see we
out.
got a crowd waiting for us to stop talking. Hi Sue.
Hey.
Hi Fred.
Hello,
Well, the
John.
rest of
Hello,
the rest of
Fred.
the
Hello,
crowd's here.
Rachel.
Hi.
Hey. Hey, Sue.
I'm so confused, Fred. Where are we?
Mhm. Well, actually, I got kind of confused too. I made a mistake last time.
Oh,
There are certain Shabbats where you read two parshas rather than just one, and
Right.
that's what we had last Saturday. We read Tatria and Metzora, two of them, and actually the coming Shabbat we read two of them, which is Acharei Mot and Kedoshim. That's really the readings that's coming up. So we're actually going to be starting on chapter 16 in Leviticus.
Okay, 16.
Yeah,
If I put on my glasses, I may be able to see it.
yeah,
The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron.
that's it. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. In fact, since you've already started, go ahead and read 1 through 5.
The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, who died when they drew too close to the presence of the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell your brother Aaron that he is not to come at will into the shrine behind the curtain in front of the cover that is upon the ark, lest he die, for I appear in the cloud over the cover. Thus only shall Aaron enter the shrine with the bull of a herd for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall be dressed in sacral linen tunic with linen breeches next to his flesh, and be girded with a linen sash, and he shall wear a linen turban. These are sacred vestments. He shall bathe his body in water and then put them on. And from the Israelite community, he will take 2 he goats for a sin offering and a ram for the burnt offering."
Yeah. So again, it's emphasizing that's the downside of being a priest. You come into the sanctuary at the wrong time, touch the wrong stuff, you get zapped. It's actually dangerous to be a priest. But what he's describing here is the directions for how to do Yom Kippur, of the Day of Atonement. This is the way the Day of Atonement was done, when we have the temple. And of course, the 2 goats, one of which is going to be the scapegoat. And this is described in verses 6 to 10. Somebody want to read 6 to 10?
Sure, I will. Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. Then he shall take the 2 goats and set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And Aaron shall cast lots over the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord, and the other lot for Azazel. And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord, and use it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away from the wilderness to Azel.
Yeah. So actually, here you have the where you get the concept of the scapegoat. The goat for Azazel is the goat who escapes,
Oh, it's
being
a goat that gets to
sacrificed.
live then.
Yeah. Well, sort of.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Now the Azazel, nobody really knows where that name comes from. Apparently, it's some kind of demon, and none of the commentators are really sure where the name Azazel comes from. It's not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible or any other ancient writings anybody can find. But it's a funny thing, actually. It's become a expression in modern Hebrew in Israel today. If you want to tell somebody to go to hell, you say Lech Azazel. Or if you just want to say the hell with it, it's La Azazel.
Yeah,
It's
okay.
it's very common slang in Israel today, taken from these verses.
So
And then, yeah,
this was a male goat.
yeah, I think it says a he goat somewhere
Yeah,
in
two
there.
male
Yeah.
goats,
Uh-huh.
and they
Yeah.
they do lots.
Uh-huh.
And the one that gets the short straw gets to be sacrificed, and the other one
Yeah.
gets to escape.
Yeah. They actually tie a ribbon to its horn, which is supposed to symbolically represent the sins of Israel. And then it's supposedly led out into the desert somewhere and carries the sins of Israel, away with it. Okay.
From
Um,
whence comes the expression scapegoat.
Yeah.
Scapegoat, yeah, the goat. Well, but as we'll see in a minute, actually, it's not quite a scapegoat. Um, there's a lot of other stuff then about what he does next as far as the sacrifices, but the story of a goat really picks up with verse 20 again. And it's verse 20 through 22. If somebody wants to read that.
And when he finishes atoning for the sacred zone, and for the tent of meeting, and for the altar, he shall bring forward the live goat. And Aaron shall lay his 2 hands on the head of the live goat, and confess over it all the transgressions of the Israelites, and all their sins, according to all their offenses. And he shall put them on the head of the goat, and send it off in the hand of a man for the hour to the wilderness. And the goat shall bear upon it all their transgressions to a remote region, and he shall send off the goat to the wilderness.
Hmm.
And
Yeah. Yeah. But there's a problem with that. Rachel, as you probably know, goats are domestic animals.
yeah,
And what happens when you take a
just gonna
domestic animal
follow it
away?
right back.
It's going to follow you back home. It
Yeah.
actually got to be a problem. And so actually what they did finally when the temple was in Jerusalem a little bit later on, they actually took the goat to the edge of a ravine outside the city and threw it in. So the scapegoat didn't really escape. That goat died also. It was the only way to keep it from coming back. Um, so then they pick up with some of the other instructions for Yom Kippur, and that picks up on verse 29. And it goes through 34. And that really bears on the way that we celebrate Yom Kippur today. So if somebody wants to read 29 through 34.
And this shall be to you a law for all time. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall practice self-denial, and you shall do no matter of work, neither the citizen nor the alien who resides among you. For on this day atonement shall be made for you to cleanse you of all your sins, and you shall be clean before the Lord. It shall be a Sabbath of complete rest for you, and you shall practice self-denial. It is a law for all times. The priest who has been anointed and ordained to serve as priest in the place of the Father shall make an expiation. He shall put on the linen vestments, the sacred vestments. He shall purge the innermost shrine. He shall purge the tent of the meeting and the altar, and he shall make expiation for the priests and for all the people of the congregation. And there shall be to you a law for all time to make atonement for the Israelites for all their sins once a year. And Moses did as the Lord commanded him.
Yeah, the key thing in there, we still do it on the same date. The 7th month is the month of Tishri. And, Rosh Hashanah is the first day of Tishri, and Yom Kippur is the 10th day, of the month of Tishri. Um, but it's interesting, we often think of Yom Kippur as a fast day, but there's nothing in here specifically about fasting. What it says is what you read, you shall practice self-denial. Actually, the literal Hebrew is you shall afflict your souls, but it doesn't tell you what you're supposed to do to afflict your souls. So the later rabbis really had to interpret that. And they came up with 5 things. For them, afflicting your soul on Yom Kippur, number one, no eating or drinking. Number two, no sex. Number three, no bathing. Number four, no anointing the body with oil, which I think was a big deal in the ancient world. And number five, no wearing of leather, which I guess in the ancient world was a sign of either wealth or pleasure or something. And so most people only remember the fasting part, but actually that's one of 5 things that the rabbis made up, to cover afflicting your soul or
Is
practicing
is that
self-denial.
why the Orthodox Jews wear sneakers?
Yeah. That's kind of hard to do now though, because most sneakers have leather tops now.
Oh, okay.
So you really have to look. You have to get the old-fashioned canvas sneakers, the
Yeah.
Converse sneakers, not to
The
be wearing
synth
leather.
what if it's synthetic leather?
That would probably be okay. I don't know. The other thing is you see a lot of people who come in wearing sneakers, but they have a leather belt on, which also would be a no-no.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to wear any kind of leather on that day. And then they go on in chapter 17, sort of a grab bag of all kinds of different laws. One is kind of interesting. The first 9 verses of chapter 17 tells you basically what you have to do to eat meat. Um, Somebody wants to read verses 1 through 9 on chapter 17.
Okay.
Uh,
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the people of Israel, and say to them, This is the thing that the Lord has commanded. If any one of the house of Israel kills an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp, or kills it outside the camp, and does not bring it to the entrance to the tent of meeting to offer it as a gift to the Lord in front of the tabernacle of the Lord, blood guilt shall be imputed to that man. He shall shed blood, and that man shall be cut off from among his people. This is to the end that people of Israel may bring their sacrifices that they sacrifice in the open field, that they may bring them to the Lord, to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and sacrifice them as sacrifices of peace offerings to the Lord. And the priest shall throw the blood on the altar of the Lord at the entrance of the tent at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and burn the fat for a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So they shall no more sacrifice their sacrifices to goat demons, after whom they whore. This shall be a statute forever for them throughout their generations. And you shall say to them, Any one of the house of Israel, or of the strangers who sojourn upon them, who offers a burnt offering or sacrifice, and does not bring it to the entrance to the tent of meeting, and to offer it to the Lord, that man shall be cut off from his people.
Yeah. So what they're saying is two things really. One is that no, you can't offer sacrifices on your own. No do-it-yourself sacrifices. It can only be done, by a proper anointed priest, in either in the sanctuary then or later on in the temple. But the other thing is, and a lot of historians believe that the way this was originally intended, you couldn't eat meat except in a religious context. In other words, if you wanted to slaughter a lamb to make a meal for your family, you couldn't do it on your own in your backyard. You actually had to bring the animal to the priest. He had to slaughter it in the proper way and sprinkle the blood, and you actually shared the a meal with the priest. So I think probably goes back, it may go back to the concept that there's something kind of suspicious about eating to begin with. You remember after Noah's flood, God says to Noah, if you have to eat meat, go ahead and eat meat. I'm giving you permission to eat meat. Just don't drink the blood. Whereas, beginning with Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, basically, they were vegans. You can eat whatever grows, in the garden. And so one theory is that basically the idea of eating meat to begin with is kind of a concession to human weakness, um, and so that yeah, the only way you would have been allowed to eat meat is as part of a religious ceremony. You had to bring the animal to the priest slaughtered it, then you and the priest together shared the meal.
That probably makes a lot of sense because there probably wasn't a large number of animals that were edible versus
Yeah.
grains and fruits or berries or, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and you'd assume probably most of the domestic animals you really need for their milk or for their eggs or
Yeah.
what they produced. Particularly if you weren't really affluent, didn't have that many animals, slaughtering one of your animals was a big deal.
Hmm.
And then we go over to chapter 18, okay, which is a whole different thing. Now they get into the sexual laws. allowed and forbidden sexual relationships. And it starts off with verses 1 through 6 as kind of a general introduction. Does somebody want to read verses 1 through 6 on chapter 18?
I'll read
Yeah.
now that I'm finished eating. Um, Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, I, Adonai, am your God. You shall not copy the practices of the land of Egypt, where you dwelt, or the land of Canaan, to which I am taking you, nor shall you follow their laws. My rules alone shall you observe and faithfully follow my laws. I, Adonai, am your God. You shall keep my laws and my rules, by the pursuit of which human beings shall live. I am Adonai. Adonai. None of you men shall come near anyone of his own flesh to uncover nakedness. I am Adonai." Hmm.
There's one very to the rabbis, there's one very important phrase in there in verse 5. You shall keep my statutes and ordinances, which if a man do, he shall live by them. And so this is where the teaching comes from that let's say if it's a Shabbat or Yom Kippur or any holiday, let's say someone is sick, he can see a doctor. A doctor can treat a patient on the Sabbath. Life always comes first because basically you're supposed to live by these commandments, not die because of them. And so that all of the ritual commandments can be put on hold if it's a question of human life or health. It's really taken from that verse. And then basically, they go over, there's a long list that follows that. You can see if you look down there of all their forbidden sexual relationships. Basically incestuous ones, your
Yeah.
mother, your aunt, your sister, on and on. Um, there are two that are kind of interesting, though.
Well,
Yeah,
Fred, I have a question for you
yeah.
because so a year ago, my younger daughter got married, and it was a Jewish wedding up in the mountains of Denver. And all of the women, separate from the men, not in within
Hmm.
any visual sight, even though, and I didn't partake, a bunch of the women from the wedding and the groom and groomsmen and his father and friends, they all jumped into the water naked. And they said this
Wow.
was a ritual, like an Israeli ritual. And I had never heard of that. And,
Yeah.
but I'm not the most knowledgeable person anyway. And
Well,
so that
that's kind of out of it.
seems to go against what's here.
Yeah. Well, actually, I've never heard of that custom before. There is a custom among Orthodox Jews that the bride always goes to the mikveh, before the wedding ceremony. And in some communities, both the bride and the groom visit the mikveh before the wedding. I've never heard of what you're describing.
Actually,
That's
I might, I don't know if I have. I'm sure I've got it somewhere,
yeah.
what they
Because you have
exactly
to
called it.
remember yeah. When this text talks about exposing nakedness, they're not talking about just looking on nakedness. It's a euphemism for sex. Biblical
Right.
Hebrew doesn't really have any
Oh,
direct words for sex, so it kind of has a bunch of workarounds. And one of them is uncovering the nakedness of someone it's really just an idiom that means having sex with them. So these are
Yeah,
all the categories of people you can't have sex with.
I got you. Oh, they actually had a formal name for what they did. I'll
Yeah.
have to look it up.
Yeah, I'd like to find out about that. You don't have a video of that, do you?
No, I didn't even
No.
partake. And it was interesting. My existing son-in-law, my older daughter's um, husband, who partaked, um, he was like, Harold, you really didn't need to see me or your future son-in-law naked, and we didn't need to see
Right.
you naked.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but they actually had a formal name for it. I just don't remember what
Yeah.
it
I've,
is.
ne- I've never heard. I'll ask the rabbi this Saturday. Maybe she's heard of it. I've never heard of that at a
Hmm.
wedding.
So I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
All right,
But, you know,
you had two
there's
other things to talk about.
yeah. Okay. Yeah, if you look down this list, it gives you all the forbidden relationships. I think one interesting one, though, is in verse 18. Verse 18 says, "You shall not take a woman and her sister to uncover her nakedness." So you can't marry both a woman and her sister, even though polygamy is permitted. So there's no the law against marrying more than one woman, but you can't marry sisters. Well, when you think about it, this is exactly what Jacob did. He married Rachel and Leah, and of course the commentators say, well, that he got away with that because the Torah hadn't been given yet. So what he did, though, later would be illegal, marrying
But
sisters.
what if one sister died? I mean, because there is another portion in the Torah that says that what is it? I thought that the brother of a male that dies is supposed to marry um,
The
the
widow.
widow.
Widow, yeah, yeah, that's required, but that's only after her first husband has died.
Right,
You know,
but
the
so can a man marry the sister if the wife died?
Yeah, I would assume if one sister dies, you can marry the other. Yeah, but you can't have them both as your wives at the
Right.
same time.
All
And
right.
actually, for that matter, Abraham was breaking these rules because Abraham and Sarah were half siblings. She was his half sister. So a lot of these unions, before the Torah was given, would have been forbidden. After the Torah was given. And of course, the other thing that is probably one of particularly among a lot of Christians, is probably one of the best known verses in here. If you look at verse 22, "You shall not lie with mankind as with womankind, it is an abomination." So, for people who are against gay marriage, this is the biblical basis for that. One thing I thought was kind of interesting about that verse, though, it doesn't say anything about lesbians. Is it okay to be a lesbian? Now, the Bible doesn't say anything one way or the other about it. It may be because they figure that what women didn't matter. It was, this is a male-oriented religion anyway, and so only what men do counts. What women do with other women, we don't need any rules about that. But it's always interested me. I meet a lot of fundamentalist Christians, particularly the Bob Jones people, here in Greenville, who say we're against gay marriage, and they'll quote this verse, and they say we live by the Bible, we live by Scripture. Well, usually I ask them, I say, do you realize though that a few chapters before this, there's a verse that says that you can't eat anything that comes out of the water that doesn't have fins and scales. That's also an abomination. So, you can say you're against gay marriage on biblical grounds, and that's valid. But if you want to be consistent, you got to pass on the shrimp and grits. You know, people pick and choose which
Yeah,
rules
yeah.
they're gonna follow from the Bible.
Yeah.
That's uh, that probably goes back forever.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, you can't. If you're consistent, there's a whole lot of things that would change.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, one
Many,
of the things is we started this, he talks about God talks to Moses and reinforces you can't be like you were in Egypt, and you
Yeah.
can't be where like you were in I forget where, Canaan,
Canaan,
Or in Canaan. Yeah.
which would that's singling out that Moses has to make sure that the Jewish population had, worships the one God and follows that God's rule,
Yeah.
his rule.
Yeah. And
Am I
probably a
reading
lot, a
that
lot.
right?
Yeah. Probably a lot of the some of the rules the rabbis made, which we don't really have any obvious reason for, probably come under that heading. There were things that the pagans did, lived around them, and so Jews were prohibited from doing it.
Right.
A good example, is the separating milk and meat, in the kosher diet rule, which is not really literally in the Torah. It says, don't boil the kid in its mother's milk. And nobody really knows where that comes from, but the best guess the archaeologists can make, it was probably an ancient Canaanite fertility ritual. You would take the firstborn of an animal, uh, sacrifice it, then cook it in its mother's milk, and that was supposed to
Oh.
guarantee fertility, for the whole flock or the whole herd.
Mhm.
So really, that comes under the heading of "Don't do as like the heathens do."
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
probably where we got it from. Okay, that's the Achare Mot Parsha. But the second Parsha that we read, this coming Shabbat is called Kedoshim, and that's the one that starts on chapter 19, which is and that really deals with some of the ethical laws of Judaism. Um, the first set of rules really is one chapter, well, actually verse 1 through 14. Someone want to read those 14 verses?
Sure. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to all the community of Israelites, and you shall say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Every man shall revere his mother and his father, and my Sabbaths you shall keep. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to the idols, nor make molten gods for yourselves. I am the Lord your God. And when you sacrifice communion sacrifices to the Lord, you should sacrifice it so that it will be acceptable for you. On the day you sacrifice, it shall be eaten, and on the morrow, and what is left to the third day shall be burned in fire. And if in fact it is eaten on the third day, it is desecrated meat. It shall not be acceptable, and he who eats it shall bear his guilt. For he has profaned the Lord's holiness, and that person shall be cut off from his kin. And when you reap your land's harvest, you shall not finish off the edge of your field, nor pick up the gleanings of your harvest. In your vineyard you shall not pluck bare, nor pick up the fallen fruit of your vineyard. For the poor and for the sojourner you shall leave them. I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal, you shall not dissemble, and you shall not lie. No man to his fellow. You shall not swear falsely in my name, profaning the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not defraud your fellow man, and you shall not rob. You shall not keep the hired man's wages with you through the night till morning. You shall not vilify the deaf. For the blind you shall not put a stumbling block. And you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall
Yeah,
do no iniquity in justice.
yeah. That's a lot of stuff. One of the things you see right away is it's kind of a grab bag of different stuff, none of which have any relationship to each other. It's the kind of thing when you read this, you have to ask who edited this book. Why couldn't they put all the laws about agriculture in one place and all the sacrifice laws in another chapter and all the laws about theft and whatnot in another chapter? But it's all just jumbled together in here. And it's to make it even more difficult, actually, most of these laws are going to be repeated in Deuteronomy, but in a different form and with other details added to them. And it was really a problem that, the rabbis of the Greco-Roman period saw right away. And this is really one of the reasons that they wrote the Mishnah after the end of the second century. The Mishnah at least divides all the laws up into six major groups. And it was the first attempt to try to sort this stuff out and put it in some kind of logical order. So, if you wanted to know all the agricultural laws, it would be in one section of the Mishnah instead of just sprinkled around, in different chapters the way it is here. Um, the, the, uh, the rules here, let's see, verse 9, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap the corners. They don't really say how big the corners are, but you do have to leave the corners of your field for the poor to harvest. And the other thing, of course, is your harvesters go over the field. They're not allowed to go back. If they miss something or if they don't pick up some of the stuff they've cut, they have to leave it. And then the gleaning is the poor can follow after them, and pick up what's left over there. You see this in the book of Ruth. Naomi sends Ruth over to her kinsman Boaz, and Boaz allows Ruth to follow the harvesters, and pick up whatever they miss when they go over the field. Um, The other really interesting one is 14, where it says, "You shall not insult the deaf, and you shall not put a stumbling block before the blind." I mean, you would first read that, it sounds like, who would do that? It's almost like some like really cruel prank somebody would play on someone. But the rabbis actually made this a major teaching in business law. The way they interpret "you shall not put a stumbling block before the blind" is that you're not allowed to take advantage of someone else's ignorance or naivete to take advantage of them in a business deal. Um, well, actually, we have laws already which really are based on this kind of teaching. For instance, we don't allow people to sell alcohol to children because that's putting a stumbling block before the blind. It's really why we have laws that insist on accurate labeling of stuff that we buy. Again, selling somebody a can of something, not knowing all the stuff that's in it, is putting a stumbling block before the blind. Um, and it really made a difference actually in the way rabbinic courts worked as compared to the Roman courts. For instance, if you had a case where a customer was charging a merchant with misrepresenting the goods that he was selling to him, if the case was heard in a rabbinic court, it would tend to favor the customer because, again, the principle that the court would use is not putting a stumbling block before the blind. On the other hand, if you took that case to a Roman court, the Roman legal principle was caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. In other words, people should look out for themselves. So basically, if you're the customer, you'd be better off in front of a rabbinic court. If you were the merchant, you'd want a Roman judge, hearing your case. Right? And then they throw in some more agricultural stuff after that. And let's see, yeah, 15 through 19 is kind of interesting. So I want to read those verses.
You shall not render an unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. Judge your kinsman fairly. Do not deal basely with your countrymen. Do not profit by the blood of your fellow. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your kinfolk in your heart. Reprove your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your countrymen. Love your fellow as yourself. I am the Lord, and you shall observe my laws.
Okay. Yeah, there's the obvious, the not favoring rich or poor is an obvious teaching. The one where it says you shall not profit by the blood of your neighbor, there the literal Hebrew, let me look at it again. Yeah. Yeah, you shall not stand by the blood of your neighbor. And again, there are multiple interpretations of that. One is that you have to take vengeance, if someone harms your neighbor. If someone is harming your neighbor, then you have to take vengeance for it. Another one is that you can't profit by hurting your neighbor. The real crux of that verse is how are you going to define the blood of your neighbor? Some of the rabbis said it doesn't mean necessarily physical blood. It doesn't mean injury or killing someone. Anytime someone does anything that reduces someone else's dignity as a human being, whether you rob them, spread lies about them, cheat them in business, whatever, in metaphorically at least you're spilling their blood. And so they would interpret, that verse, "You shall not stand by the blood of your neighbor, or not profit by the blood of your neighbor," is that you're not allowed to gain something from yourself by doing anything that takes away from the dignity of your neighbor. And then it goes on starting with verse 19. Um, Verse 19 is really weird. "You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let thy cattle gender with diverse kinds. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed, and neither shall there come upon thee a garment of two kinds of stuff mingled together." And nobody's really sure, why that is. And again, it may be something that the pagans were doing and you're not allowed to do what they're doing. But actually, it's still a thing with modern Orthodox Jews. The idea they interpret the not wearing two kinds of stuff as not mixing linen and wool with on the same garment. You know, you can't buy a suit if it has, let's say, oh, it's a wool suit, but it has a linen lining. And actually, if you go to places like Brooklyn, there are actually tailor shops where you can bring your suit and they'll inspect it to make sure, that it's okay, that it doesn't mix two different kinds of cloth together. So there are really people who still live, by that verse about not mixing stuff.
But now with all the modern nylons
Yeah.
that, you go and pick up something and it says it's 50% cotton and 50%
Hmm.
nylon or whatever. Is
Yeah.
is that against the rules too?
That's interesting. I asked Rabbi Marco that once when he was here. He said he didn't think so. He didn't think that of course, they didn't have any artificial fabrics
No.
in anyway, but he didn't think that artificial fabrics would count. It was only if it were natural stuff like linen, wool, or cotton, that you can't mix the two of them together.
But the first about mixing the breeds, or you
Yeah.
should not let your cattle breed with a different kind.
Yeah, I don't know. Why anybody would want to do that, would want to try to mate a sheep with a bull or something. It's
Oh,
hard for
I
me to
was thinking of
imagine
different breeds of cattle or different kinds of to get
it could
something
be.
that
It
maybe
depends
produces.
yeah, it depends how you want to interpret the verse. Um,
Yeah.
some people say it should be interpreted as you can't plow by yoking an ox and an ass together. It has to be two oxen or two donkeys pulling the plow. You're not allowed to combine two animals together, to work for you, and they interpret it that way.
So
The
mate in a
rationale.
working pair versus like mate for breeding.
Yeah, it
I
could be
gotcha.
it could
Okay.
be interpreted that way. And again, nobody really knows the rationale, so it's assumed probably it's something the pagans were doing, and so you're not allowed to do it. Um,
Well, I
Well, and
suppose
this,
if they were if it was in the working sense and one was much stronger than the other, it could hurt it. The other one, the
well,
weaker one, could be
that
hurt.
I've heard that explanation that if you put an ox and a donkey together pulling the plow, it's really not fair to the donkey because it can't keep up, with the ox as far as pulling the
yeah.
plow. So you're really being cruel to one of the animals by doing that. That's probably the best rationale you can think of for that.
The two types of grain, if you tie these two things together, the two types of grain
Mhm,
that get mixed in a field, if you did that, your harvest and the quality of what you're eating could
mhm.
be far different. In other words, wheat and say something else that casts
But
off seeds.
Yeah.
but let's no, John, what if it's not at the same time? What if I have a barley field and then I overseed it after the barley harvest with wheat? Now I
Mhm.
have sow in my field with two different kinds of seed.
That's a good point. Because that deals over time, which people do winter wheat and they come back and put in
Right,
soybeans.
right.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Varying crops. But I don't think that's what the verse is referring to. They're just saying you can't sow your field with two different kinds of seed at the same time. You
Well,
wonder really why anybody would want to do that to begin with.
Yeah.
So, and again, it may be referring to some kind of ancient Canaanite practice, that we don't really understand, but it's one of the things they did it, so you can't do it. It's,
But
there's another
because
interesting,
if you do it with two
yeah,
types of seeds, one of them is corrupted. The better one is corrupted by the poor seeds.
it could be, yeah, that may be the rationale for it. Yeah. There's another interesting agricultural law, though there is a reason for it. If you look at verse 23, when it says, when you shall come into the land and you've planted all manner of trees for food, then you shall count the fruit thereof as forbidden. 3 years shall it be forbidden to you. It cannot be eaten. In the 4th year, all the fruit thereof is holy for giving praise to the Lord. But in the 5th year, you may eat of the fruit thereof, that it may yield unto you more richly the increase thereof. So basically, you plant a fruit tree, a fig tree, say, you can't eat anything from it for the first 3 years. The 4th year, you can pick the fruit, but you got to take it to the temple. That belongs to the priest. And then the 5th year on, then you can eat whatever fruit comes off it. And people, who are really into this have told me that actually it makes sense. The tree actually will be healthier and bear more fruit over the long run if you let it go the first 3 years without picking the fruit. So that's when there actually is a rationale for.
Well, in the first few years, the fruit isn't really that good anyway.
That may have come into it also. Yeah.
Yeah. So what about grapes? And is that considered fruit in the same
Um,
sense?
well, it
It's
says
a
trees.
vine.
Yeah, yeah, but this says specifically trees.
Yes.
So I assume it really is only tree fruits that they're talking about. And then there's one that actually is again important with ultra Orthodox Jews now. If you look at verse 27, you shall not round the corners of your heads, neither shall you mar the corners of your beard. And again, this is one that nobody's exactly sure the reason for it. But if you see very Orthodox Jews, they have these long side locks. They're called payas in Yiddish. And that really is their interpretation of this verse. You're not allowed to cut the hair that grows at the corners of your head, which they define as the sideburns. You just let your sideburns grow, and that's where these long, side locks they have come from. And then in verse 28, you shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, or imprint any marks upon you. And this is kind of, that was again, these are pagan customs. People would actually cut themselves as a sign of mourning for the dead. Um, but the other part of this, you shall not make imprint any marks on you. And Orthodox Jews have interpreted this as you shall not, no tattoos. It's a law against any body tattoos. Other people interpret this that you shall not put on tattoos as a sign of mourning for the dead. It doesn't prohibit all tattooing. And Orthodox rabbis typically will say that all tattoos are out. Some more liberal rabbis would say no, it doesn't bar all tattoos. It's only you can't do it as a mourning custom for the dead because that's a pagan custom.
I have heard that it's a question of it being a graven image, a tattoo.
I've never heard it put that way. Hmm. So among the ultra Orthodox, they will not bury anyone in their cemetery who has tattoos. And that it may be you may be right. They may consider it really as a kind of a graven image type thing.
Well,
Hmm.
because the term tattoo, it would indicate that way back then, even then, people were tattooing themselves. That some of these other tribes and what have you. Is that the
Yeah,
same
I think
is
a
tattoo
lot
the
of
way
this.
we
Yeah,
think of it today?
yeah, I think a lot of this really right comes under the heading is don't do what the heathens do. The reason
Yeah.
these things are listed because they are all things that some tribe or other in the area did, and you can't do that because probably if you do that, then before you know it, you'll be doing other stuff they do and worshiping their idols and on and on. And so this is the way you have to keep yourself separate by not adopting any of the customs of the people that are around you.
Hmm.
Um,
In
and
31, it says, do not turn to ghosts and do not inquire of familiar spirits to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. But who was it who consulted the spirits before the battle?
that's a good question. Yeah, that's That's verse 31 that you just read. And there are two questions about that. Why is it being prohibited? Is it prohibited, number one, because it's really a sham? Nobody can really talk to the dead. And so it really is a con game and you shouldn't be involved in it. Or on the other hand, can these people really talk to the dead? But you're not supposed to do that because that's what the pagans are doing. And actually, there is one example of, like you said, if you look at the book of Samuel, there's an episode where Saul has got a big battle coming up with the Philistines the next day, and he's really worried about it. And so Samuel has already died by that time. And so he goes to the town of Endor, and there's a woman there, an old woman who supposedly is a witch, who can commune with the dead. And Saul goes to her, and she actually calls up the spirit of Samuel for him. And Samuel actually tells them what he doesn't want to hear, that you're going to die in battle tomorrow, with the Philistines. So to me, what the Bible seems to be saying is that these people really can communicate with the dead, but you're not supposed to be using them. So there's not that it's a sham and a con game. It's real, but you're not, but you can't do that. That's what the pagans do. Um, And then 33 is, if a stranger sojourn with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. The stranger that sojourns with you shall be unto you as the homeborn among you, and you shall love him as thyself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Um, Again, this actually is the most frequently repeated commandment of the Torah. It's actually 17 times between Exodus and Deuteronomy. You're told, remember that you were a stranger in the land of Egypt. It's by far the most often repeated commandment. And then it goes on in verse 35 and said, you shall do no unrighteousness in judgment in weights or in measures. You shall have just balances, just weights, a just ephah, a just hin shall you have. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And what he's talking about, in those days they did not use coins as money yet. And so when you bought something, the merchants had this set of balance scales. And he would, let's say the price of what you were buying was 3 shekels. Well, there was a standard shekel weight. He would put 3 shekel weights in one pan of the balance, and then you would have a strip of silver. You could break off pieces of it, and you put them into the balance until the scale balanced. That's how you measured out 3 shekels. And of course, a merchant could cheat, by having an extra heavy shekel, that he would put in his pan, and that's what they really are talking about. This kind of law. There was actually book of Exodus talks about the holy shekel. Apparently there was a reference shekel weight that was kept in the temple or in the tent of meeting back in the earlier days. And so that was the reference shekel. And any other shekel had to be compared to that to make sure that it was a true weight. And then going over to chapter 20, they take up really one of the grisliest parts of the Torah, which is the cult of Moloch. That's verses 1 through 5 in chapter 20. Somebody want to read those 5 verses?
And the Lord
I
spoke to Moses, saying, and to the Israelites you shall say, every man of the Israelites and of the sojourners who sojourn in Israel, who gives of his seed to Moloch, is doomed to die. The people of the land shall stone him. And as for me, I shall set my face against that man, and cut him off from the midst of his people, for he has given of his seed to Moloch, so as to defile my sanctuary and to profane my sacred name. And if the people of the land actually avert their eyes from that man when he gives of his seed to Moloch, not putting him to death, I myself shall turn my face against that man and his clan, and I shall cut him off, and all who go whoring after him, to whore after Molech from the midst of their people.
The cult of Moloch was basically child sacrifice, and it was actually child sacrifice by burning children alive. And it was widely practiced in the Middle East. Archaeologists have actually found ruins of altars all through the Middle East with the bones of babies and young children around them. So, child sacrifice was very common. It's what makes the story of the binding of Isaac, It's shocking to us. To people around Abraham at the time, God told him to sacrifice Isaac. They would say, "Yeah, I mean, everybody does it. Why not?" And it actually went on. There are passages in Isaiah and Jeremiah, condemning the people who are practicing the cult of Moloch. So at least as far as the 6th century BCE, people were still practicing that.
Hmm.
And apparently there was a ravine that was south of the city of Jerusalem where the cult of Moloch used to be practiced. They would take kids down into that ravine to burn them. Later on, it was when the Jews had taken over Jerusalem, that was banned, and it was actually made the municipal garbage dump. They used to burn all the refuse from the city there in that ravine, and it belonged to a man named Ben Hinnom. And so it was called the Valley of Ben Hinnom, which in Hebrew is Gay Ben Hinnom. And the later rabbis kind of compressed that to Gehinnom or Gehenna. And and in Talmudic writings, it's the rabbi's way of saying going to hell. You go to Gehenna. And what it refers back to is that ravine back south of Jerusalem, where at one time children were burned alive.
So was there an age span of allowable age span for the sacrifice of children, or was it anywhere from birth to?
Yeah, we don't really know. I don't think anybody knows. It was mainly young children, but I don't know what ages there were. And we know really of at least one Judean king who sacrificed one of his own children, King Manasseh, who's supposedly one of the wickedest kings of Judah. There's an episode where he's involved in some battle and it's not going well, and he sacrifices one of his sons, to try to get God to give him a hand and turn the battle. So child sacrifice was really very common. And in fact, one theory is that the reason that God made Abraham go through this thing with Isaac is he was trying to make a point. I don't want child sacrifice anymore. We're not going to do that anymore.
Fred, if I'm not mistaken, I think the Aztecs did that.
Yeah, well, they did adults also. Literally tearing people's hearts out.
Yeah.
While they were still beating. Yeah, yeah. Human sacrifice was really common in almost every culture. Um, even the Greeks and Romans occasionally, before they would go out to battle, might decide to sacrifice a couple of slaves to the gods. Just in fact, in the Iliad, before Agamemnon and his army, sailed for Troy, the problem they had, the wind was blowing the wrong way. The fleet couldn't get underway for the voyage to Troy, and
Mhm.
so Agamemnon sacrifices his own daughter, Iphigenia, to the gods in order to get a favorable wind for the voyage to Troy. And this sets up a whole set of tragic events that follow that. There's a whole series of Greek tragedies that begin with the sacrifice of Iphigenia and go down to the whole destruction of the house of Agamemnon later on.
But
So yeah, it was very common in every culture
yeah.
and not just in the Middle East. In fact, Maimonides had a theory. He said, God never really wanted sacrifice in the first place, even animal sacrifice. What he really wanted was prayer and study. But, he thought it would be too radical a culture shock to go from human sacrifice, just to prayer and study, just immediately. And so the animal sacrifice was kind of intermediate step. Stop sacrificing people, start sacrificing animals, and later you can wean them off that, and just study in prayer. Of course, we don't know how long the animal cult would have gone on if the Romans hadn't destroyed the temple in the 1st century. And who knows how long it might have gone on before we finally gave up on it.
Yeah. And again, it's to differentiate our God from all of the various other cults and what have you that existed in the world.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of the stuff really has no rationale that we know about, other than the fact that other people were doing it, and you've got to separate yourself from the
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
around you. That's probably the only rationale you can really come up for a lot of this stuff.
Well, isn't even that the reason for circumcision initially? So they
Well,
could tell the
nobody really
difference?
knows. Circumcision was actually practiced by some other cultures. the Egyptians circumcised their priests. And of course, Muslims practice circumcision, but they do it at 13 rather than at 8 days. But yeah, you're lucky you didn't grow up in a Muslim community.
Ain't enough alcohol or yeah.
Yeah, and nobody really knows the rationale for that. Maimonides had this theory, he was kind of a prude, and he said it kept you from getting excessive pleasure from sex, so it kept you from being a sex addict. Um, but actually, that actually became a subject that people started arguing about, whether circumcision should be permitted or not. Some European countries are actually debating outlawing it because they said you're mutilating the body of a baby, who really can't give informed consent for it. But whether it apparently though there are papers in the urologic literature, men who were circumcised as adults, and so they had sex before and after being circumcised, and most of them say it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't affect sexual pleasure at all. So Maimonides was apparently wrong about that. Yeah. So,
I will not be available next week. I'll be in California
well,
and
okay. Well,
in
next
transit.
week, next week we do the Parsha Amor, which starts on chapter 21 in Leviticus.
Very cool.
That again is a whole grab bag of different laws that are totally unrelated to each other. You really wish you could have met the editor of this book to figure, what the rationale was for jumbling everything up the way they do it. So,
There must have been a good reason
yeah, I'm sure there
Or
was,
or no reason.
or
for
no
no
reason.
reason. You're
I
right.
I
Yeah.
think
Okay.
the authors probably didn't want to concede, and so they all got their own little sections.
It could be. But, in a modern publisher, any modern editor would take all the agricultural laws, put them in one chapter, take all the sexual laws, put them in another chapter. You put it in some kind of a way that somebody would have a way to have that whole area of a law at one time. Um, and the Mishnah kind of does that by dividing everything up into 6 major categories. That's kind of a start to doing that. But even that, is really wasn't that helpful. And Maimonides actually was the first guy to actually publish a law code. He took all the laws, put them into 14 different categories, and there's a table of contents and an index. And the one that most people use, though, was put together in Safed in northern Israel in the 15th century, and it's called the Shulchan Aruch, which means the prepared table. And it has all the laws classified according to various categories. And actually, the book that Orthodox Jews really use to live by is the Shulchan Aruch. It's really the standard Jewish law book. So,
Well, so we're starting on chapter 21 next week.
yeah, we'll start with chapter 21, which is Parsha Amor next week.
Okay. Harold, have a safe trip.
Yeah.
I
Thank
hope
you.
Call
to.
next Tuesday.
We'll miss
Yeah.
you.
Same here.
Okay. See you next week.
Thank you, Fred.
Bye-bye.
Excellent as always.
Yes, thank you, Fred.
Bye.